Erich von Manstein was, by any measure, one of the most brilliant military minds of the 20th century. His name evokes images of meticulously planned offensives, audacious maneuvers, and the kind of operational artistry that turns battles into almost poetic displays of strategy. Yet behind the accolades, medals, and post-war fame lay a complex, morally fraught story, one of obedience, denial, and the ultimate reckoning with the limits of genius when confronted with human catastrophe. Born in 1887 into the rigid hierarchy of Prussian nobility, Manstein inherited more than a name. He inherited an ethos of duty, discipline, and loyalty that would define his worldview. From a young age, he was trained to revere order, hierarchy, and the chain of command. These formative years instilled in him the conviction that a soldier's duty was clear, precise, and unquestionable. Yet, as the horrors of war unfolded, this very discipline would shape both his achievements and his moral blindness. Manstein entered military service at a time when the German Empire still viewed war as an art form. For him, the battlefield was a canvas, and every division, battalion, and artillery battery was a brushstroke. His early career in World War I revealed a mind capable of rapid calculations, bold improvisations, and a profound understanding of maneuver warfare. Where others saw chaos, he discerned patterns. Where others hesitated, he struck decisively. These qualities would later elevate him to the upper echelons of the Wehrmacht, earning the trust of his superiors and eventually Adolf Hitler himself. By 1940, Manstein had reached the apex of his military career. He was the architect of the audacious plan that would crush France with lightning speed, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line in a maneuver that stunned the world. The plan relied on speed, deception, and a meticulous orchestration of armor and infantry. Success came swiftly, cementing his reputation as a master strategist. Hitler lauded him, and his tactical brilliance became a centerpiece of Nazi propaganda, even as the political and moral implications of his allegiance were largely overlooked. Yet the very genius that made him a military star also sowed the seeds of his eventual moral reckoning. As Germany turned its attention eastward, Manstein found himself commanding operations on the vast and brutal Eastern Front, a theater where strategy collided with ideology in ways few could have anticipated. Here, the Wehrmacht's operational victories were inseparable from the atrocities committed by units under their command. Villages burned, civilians massacred, and entire populations displaced, yet these realities were often hidden behind reports of battlefield success, obscured by the fog of war, and rationalized under the doctrine of obedience. Manstein's personal diaries and later memoirs reveal a man intensely focused on military outcomes. He measured success by territory gained, lines held, and enemy forces neutralized. The moral dimension, the human cost beyond the tactical calculations, was often secondary, not necessarily out of malice, but out of the ingrained ethos of an officer corps that prized duty above conscience. This tension between operational brilliance and ethical blindness would define his career and shape the narrative he sought to construct after the war. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point, both for Germany and for Manstein personally. As the Sixth Army became encircled, suffering unimaginable losses, he was tasked with attempting relief operations that ultimately failed to reverse the catastrophe. His post-war reflections emphasized that the disaster was not caused by the incompetence of soldiers, but by Hitler's obsessive interference in military planning. Orders that ignored logistical realities, ideological imperatives that dictated strategy over pragmatism, and a refusal to heed professional advice led, in Manstein's view, to Germany's undoing. Yet even as he criticized Hitler's strategic failings, Manstein did not fully confront the moral dimensions of the war he served. In his memoir Lost Victories, he portrayed himself as a betrayed professional, a soldier whose brilliance was undermined by political interference. The narrative carefully sidestepped complicity in the broader crimes of the Nazi regime, casting the Wehrmacht as a force of honor and precision rather than one intertwined with ideological brutality. This portrayal, while captivating, laid the groundwork for the post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht, a notion that would dominate historical discourse for decades. Manstein's dismissal in 1944 signaled both a personal and professional reckoning. By openly challenging Hitler, he had crossed a line few others dared approach. Yet survival in a collapsing regime required navigating an impossible moral terrain. Loyalty to one's oath and comrades, obedience to orders, and the ever-present shadow of complicity in crimes beyond the battlefield. These contradictions would haunt him long after the guns fell silent, shaping both his reputation and the historical interpretation of his life. The dichotomy at the heart of Manstein's story is striking. On one hand, he was a man capable of orchestrating maneuvers that altered the course of battles and demonstrated unparalleled understanding of operational art. On the other, he was a man whose vision of warfare was so narrowly focused on tactical outcomes that it blinded him to the suffering inflicted in pursuit of those victories. His genius, while undeniable, was inseparable from a moral inertia that allowed atrocities to occur in the name of strategic necessity. Manstein's post-war life illustrates the complexity of this duality. Tried and convicted for war crimes in 1949, he spent only 4 years in prison, his sentence mitigated by his military reputation and the geopolitical context of the early Cold War. Upon release, he returned to writing and reflection, publishing memoirs that would cement his image as a master strategist wronged by circumstance. Yet historical scrutiny has gradually unraveled the myth he cultivated, revealing the uncomfortable truth. Operational brilliance cannot absolve moral failure, and obedience without conscience leaves a haunting legacy. The story of Erich von Manstein is not merely the story of a soldier or a strategist. It is the story of how intellect and morality can collide in the furnace of war. It is a reminder that tactical genius does not guarantee ethical clarity, and that understanding the art of war does not ensure comprehension of humanity. His life forces historians and audiences alike to wrestle with questions that extend beyond battlefield maps and operational plans. Can one serve a regime while remaining morally intact? Can strategic insight exist independently of ethical awareness? Manstein's legacy suggests the answers are far from simple. In the coming sections, the exploration of Manstein's life will delve deeper into the campaigns that defined him, the battles that revealed both his brilliance and blind spots, and the post-war narratives that sought to separate his strategic genius from the human cost of the conflicts he helped weigh. The tension between military mastery and moral responsibility will emerge as the defining theme of a life lived at the intersection of war, obedience, and the haunting pursuit of truth. As Manstein assumed greater responsibility on the Eastern Front, his operational brilliance became more pronounced, yet so too did the ethical ambiguities of his command. The vast expanses of the Soviet Union provided him with opportunities to execute sweeping maneuvers that would make him famous in military circles, yet they also exposed the stark realities of a war fought with brutality on both sides. Manstein's campaigns combined meticulous planning, rapid troop movements, and audacious flanking attacks, allowing German forces to achieve operational success even when faced with daunting numerical superiority. His approach to warfare emphasized flexibility, initiative, and the exploitation of terrain. Units under his command were encouraged to act decisively, to anticipate enemy moves, and to exploit weaknesses immediately. In battles such as Kharkov in 1943, Manstein's ability to coordinate counteroffensives with precision showcased his talent for turning the tide against numerically superior Soviet forces. Entire armies were redirected with almost surgical efficiency, trapping enemy divisions and forcing retreats under conditions that would have overwhelmed less skilled commanders. These operations cemented his reputation as one of the Wehrmacht's most competent field marshals and made him a valued advisor, even as Hitler's strategic decisions became increasingly erratic. Yet the very structure that allowed Manstein to achieve tactical brilliance also contributed to moral obfuscation. The operational independence he enjoyed created a buffer between battlefield decisions and the atrocities committed by units under his nominal command. While Manstein focused on movement, supply lines, and enemy positions, other elements of the Wehrmacht and associated paramilitary units carried out mass executions, deportations, and other crimes against civilians. Reports of these actions were often filtered, downplayed, or ignored within the chain of command, allowing Manstein to maintain his focus on military objectives while remaining largely insulated from the full scale of human suffering caused by the forces under his coordination. The Siege of Sevastopol and the Crimean campaigns further illustrate this duality. Manstein's strategic mind orchestrated complex assaults on heavily fortified positions, coordinating artillery, air support, and infantry maneuvers with precision. German forces overcame seemingly impregnable defenses, capturing critical objectives and securing the southern flank. Operationally, these successes were studied in military academies as exemplars of combined arms warfare. Morally, however, the campaigns were marked by high civilian casualties, the systematic targeting of noncombatants, and the participation of units involved in executions and reprisals. Manstein's writings, and those of his contemporaries, often frame these actions as necessary for operational success, effectively divorcing strategic achievement from the human cost. Manstein's growing disillusionment with Hitler emerged most forcefully during and after the disaster at Stalingrad. The encirclement and eventual surrender of the Sixth Army represented not merely a strategic defeat, but a profound moral and logistical crisis. Manstein had advocated for operational flexibility and withdrawal when necessary, yet Hitler's insistence on ideological objectives over military logic trapped entire armies in untenable positions. Manstein's post-war reflections emphasized that this catastrophe could have been avoided if military reasoning had prevailed over dictatorial inflexibility. Yet even in acknowledging Hitler's culpability, Manstein struggled to confront his own complicity. The planning, execution, and relentless pursuit of objectives that indirectly facilitated immense suffering. The tension between operational success and moral blindness continued during the final campaigns of 1944. As Germany's strategic situation deteriorated, Manstein found himself in increasingly complex operational environments where retreat and defensive positioning became necessary. He sought to manage dwindling resources, maintain troop morale, and orchestrate defensive maneuvers that minimized losses while still attempting to fulfill strategic goals. Each decision involved weighing tactical necessity against potential human cost, yet the cultural ethos of obedience and duty limited the degree to which moral considerations could influence military action. The post-war mythologization of Manstein is inseparable from these complexities. In Lost Victories, he framed his career as a narrative of strategic genius hampered by political interference. Hitler's interference in this account is presented as the decisive factor in Germany's ultimate defeat. The memoir carefully highlights operational brilliance while minimizing or ignoring broader ethical questions, emphasizing the betrayal of the professional soldier by a leader obsessed with ideology rather than rational military planning. This narrative resonated in post-war Germany, especially in a climate seeking to reconcile defeat with national honor, and helped perpetuate the idea of a clean Wehrmacht divorced from the crimes of the Nazi regime. Yet historical research has since revealed the uncomfortable truth. The Wehrmacht under Manstein was deeply enmeshed with the machinery of occupation and repression. Orders that directed troops to secure rear areas often coincided with actions taken by Einsatzgruppen, local collaborators, and auxiliary units engaged in mass executions. While Manstein's direct involvement in atrocities may remain debated, the organizational and operational environment he controlled cannot be separated from the broader context of systematic crimes. His silence, whether deliberate or convenient, functioned as a form of moral surrender, allowing the narrative of professional soldiering to eclipse accountability. Manstein's career thus exemplifies a central tension of modern military history. How to reconcile operational genius with ethical responsibility. His ability to conduct complex maneuvers, achieve rapid victories, and manage large-scale operations is undeniable. Yet the framework in which he operated, rooted in loyalty, obedience, and institutionalized hierarchy, limited his capacity or willingness to confront the full implications of the war he was waging. The same qualities that made him a master of battlefield strategy simultaneously contributed to moral blindness, illustrating that technical expertise does not automatically confer ethical insight. This duality also shaped the post-war discourse around the Wehrmacht and the German officer corps. Manstein became a symbol of the professional soldier betrayed by political interference, an emblem of competence untainted by ideology. Yet the deeper historical record challenges this simplification, demonstrating that operational brilliance cannot fully absolve moral complicity. The stories of occupation, repression, and civilian suffering reveal a more nuanced and troubling reality, one in which the lines between professional duty and ethical responsibility are blurred. As historians continue to reassess the legacy of Manstein, the questions his life poses remain urgent. Can military genius coexist with moral failure? How does one measure success when victory comes at the cost of humanity? What does obedience demand of a person when confronted with systemic evil? Manstein's story does not provide easy answers, but it illuminates the complex interplay of strategy, loyalty, and conscience in one of history's most devastating conflicts. The coming sections will explore the final campaigns of Manstein's career, the confrontations with Hitler that marked the limits of his influence, and the post-war reckoning that sought to define his legacy. Through the lens of his decisions, successes, and omissions, we see not only the mastery of war, but also the haunting consequences of failing to confront the full moral dimensions of conflict. By late 1944, the war had shifted irreversibly against Germany, and Manstein faced the grim reality that no amount of operational brilliance could overcome the strategic collapse of the Reich. The Eastern Front was a landscape of attrition, ruin, and relentless Soviet advance. Cities were reduced to rubble, entire armies shattered, and the human toll was staggering. Manstein, once celebrated for his ability to orchestrate rapid victories, now struggled to achieve even temporary stabilization under conditions of scarcity, overwhelming enemy numbers, and political interference. The genius of maneuver that had defined his earlier campaigns now collided with the inexorable weight of Germany's strategic failure. His role in the Ardennes offensive, the so-called Battle of the Bulge, illustrates both the persistence of his tactical skill and the limitations imposed by Hitler's interference. Manstein was tasked with organizing defensive operations in the West and later advising on counteroffensives. Even in these desperate circumstances, he displayed remarkable insight into troop deployment, supply logistics, and the exploitation of terrain. Yet every decision was constrained by Hitler's insistence on offensive operations at the expense of defensible positions, exposing the disconnect between military reasoning and political will. The contrast between what could be achieved with professional judgment and what was demanded by ideological obsession became increasingly stark, highlighting the limits of obedience when ethical and operational imperatives collide. Despite his growing awareness of Germany's impending defeat, Manstein remained ensnared in the complex web of loyalty, duty, and personal survival. His post-war reflections suggest a man caught between admiration for the discipline and skill of his troops and frustration with the catastrophic decisions imposed from above. Yet even in retrospect, he struggled to fully acknowledge the broader moral dimensions of his service. The atrocities committed in occupied territories, the complicity of Wehrmacht units in systematic repression, and the suffering inflicted upon millions remained, in his memoirs, largely abstracted or justified under the rubric of operational necessity. This selective memory, while understandable from a human perspective, underscores the profound ethical tension at the heart of his career, tactical genius intertwined with moral avoidance. Manstein's trial after the war would confront this duality directly. Charged with war crimes for the conduct of his armies in occupied territories, he was ultimately sentenced to imprisonment, though for a fraction of the sentence initially recommended. His relatively brief incarceration reflected both the geopolitical realities of the early Cold War and the persuasive narrative he had cultivated as a brilliant, principled soldier undermined by ideological interference. Yet historical scholarship has since revealed that operational brilliance cannot erase complicity, and that his silence in the face of atrocity carries its own moral weight. The post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht, in which Manstein featured prominently, has been systematically challenged, exposing the complexities of obedience, responsibility, and accountability in wartime. The broader significance of Manstein's life lies in the lessons it imparts about the intersection of strategy and morality. His campaigns demonstrate the heights of operational art, the precision of maneuver warfare, and the effectiveness of disciplined professional command. Yet they also illustrate the dangers inherent in a system that prizes obedience and technical skill over ethical reflection. Manstein's story is not simply one of military success or failure. It is a cautionary tale of how intelligence, skill, and loyalty can be rendered morally neutral, or even complicit when divorced from human conscience. In considering Manstein's legacy, one must grapple with the paradox at its core. He was a man who understood war with unparalleled clarity, capable of orchestrating victories that defied numerical odds and reshaped the battlefield. At the same time, he remained constrained by the very values that enabled his brilliance: unwavering loyalty, rigid adherence to command, and a focus on operational success above all else. This duality makes him a compelling figure not only in military history, but in the broader study of human behavior, ethics, and the psychology of obedience. Manstein's post-war writings, particularly Lost Victories, reflect an effort to reconcile these tensions. He sought to cast himself as a professional soldier misled and betrayed by political interference, emphasizing strategy and operational genius while minimizing or omitting moral accountability. While this narrative was influential in shaping perceptions of the Wehrmacht in Germany's military history, it also sparked controversy, forcing later historians to dissect the line between professional achievement and ethical responsibility. His memoirs serve as both a record of exceptional military skill and a study in the selective construction of historical memory. Ultimately, Manstein's story is a meditation on the limits of human understanding in the context of war. His mastery of battlefield tactics could not compensate for the moral compromises inherent in serving a regime that committed mass atrocities. The strategic brilliance that allowed him to win battles was inseparable from the culture of obedience and moral suspension that enabled systemic evil. In this light, Manstein emerges not merely as a military figure, but as a symbol of the enduring tension between human skill, ambition, and conscience. The haunting truth of Manstein's life is that mastery of war does not equate to mastery of morality. A general can command armies, manipulate terrain, and execute maneuvers with surgical precision, yet still fail to grasp the human cost of his actions. Manstein understood warfare perfectly, yet he never fully understood the implications of the system he served or the suffering it wrought. His life is a reminder that intelligence, talent, and operational success, untempered by ethical reflection, can become instruments of destruction rather than forces of justice. In reflecting upon Erich von Manstein, one confronts both admiration and unease. The admiration stems from his brilliance, decisiveness, and capacity to shape the battlefield. The unease arises from the moral ambiguities and failures that accompanied that brilliance, the silence in the face of atrocity, the selective memory, and the complicity embedded in obedience. His legacy challenges us to ask difficult questions about the nature of duty, the responsibilities of leadership, and the interplay between skill and morality in moments of crisis. As history continues to examine his life, Manstein's story remains a lens through which we can explore the complex interplay of strategy, loyalty, and conscience. It is a story of brilliance shadowed by ethical compromise, of victories achieved at immense human cost, and of a man who confronted the truth of military failure while remaining in many ways blind to the full moral consequences of his actions. In the final analysis, Erich von Manstein is remembered as both a master of war and a cautionary figure, a reminder that true understanding encompasses not only the art of battle but the measure of humanity itself.